Welcome to our special Q&A on the upcoming so-called parliamentary election in Iran. Our guest is Mr. Ali Safavi from the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Ali Safavi. Let's begin with the questions. When we are talking about elections, usually elections in a democratic system comes to our mind. Now the question is, how are the elections conducted in Iran, and is this a sort of democracy?
Thanks for having me. In response to your question, I must say absolutely not. Elections in Iran are a travesty of the electoral process. You have, according to the constitution, a vetting body called the Guardian Council. It has 12 members, 6 of whom are appointed by an unelected Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, and the other 6, supposedly lawyers, are appointed by the Judiciary Chief, who is himself appointed by the Supreme Leader. So you have an unelected Supreme Leader, an unelected vetting body, which basically supervises the election, determines the qualification of the candidates, it picks them, and then says, now choose. Now, the criteria for picking the candidates is that they must demonstrate, according to the Article 28 of the electoral law, their heartfelt and practical commitment and adherence to the principle of the Vilayat-e-Faqih, which is absolute clerical rule. So as such, this process cannot escape the thick and palpable air of illegitimacy, and therefore it is by no means legitimate and by no means an election. It is more a masquerade than anything else.
Okay, this leads us to the second question. So why does this regime bother with the concept of the election, and what does it gain from this from an election?
Well, the mullahs have used the electoral system or the elections basically to project a semblance of democracy. Naturally, they have used this process to gain tremendous amount of political and economic concessions from the West. They have sort of while all of the candidates in the parliamentary election, when it comes to fundamental issues facing this regime, domestic suppression, pillaging and plundering of the nation's wealth, export of terrorism, warmongering, intervention in neighboring countries, the nuclear weapons program, and of course the ballistic missile program, they are dubbed as so-called moderates versus the hardliners. And of course this cat and mouse game, first of all, allows them to gain concessions from their Western interlocutors, but at the same time allows those who pursue a policy of appeasement to justify giving political and economic concessions to the regime. Otherwise, it would, of course, be viewed as a totalitarian regime, which in reality it is. But with this election masquerade, it tries to deny that it is indeed a totalitarian state.
This year, most of the so-called reformist candidates have been disqualified. Why is that, and what is their latest status?
The reason that Khamenei, as the supreme leader, has chosen to disqualify so many candidates from the rival faction, the so-called reformists, has to do with the tremendous domestic, regional, and international crisis the regime is facing. Domestically, there were 2 major uprisings in Iran, one in November of 2019, which has spread to 191 cities, and another in January of 2020, which covered some 19 provinces. And in all of these protests, in all of these cities, the hundreds of thousands who came to the streets, among them, of course, many young people and women, chanted death to Khamenei, death to Rouhani, clearly demonstrating that the Iranian people will not be satisfied with anything less than the overthrow of this regime. Secondly, in the region, the regime has suffered major blows. As you know, the regime's second pillar of survival has been its policy of exporting terrorism and fundamentalism beyond Iranian borders. Now, with the uprising in Iraq, the widespread protest movement in Lebanon, that pillar is shaking. In a sense, the regime's strategic depth has suffered a serious blow. Add to that the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, the terror master who was the point man to pursue that policy. You can see that the regime is in a very critical state. Now, all of this must be seen in the context of a changing international environment where the 40-year policy of appeasement pursued by Western countries and particularly by the United States seems to be changing. With the new administration in Washington, the policy pursued by the previous administration has been discarded. No longer you have a situation where at critical moments the American administration rushes to the aid of the Iranian regime. The policy, it seems, of maximum pressure is working. The Iranian regime has been denied the resources, most importantly oil revenues, with which it has pursued the domestic suppression and, of course, regional warmongering and interference. As such, Khamenei needs to close ranks to withstand these major crises, irremediable crises at home and abroad. And that explains why, in a sense, you have a major purge of candidates from the rival faction.
What is the importance of this year's elections for the regime, and how is it different from the elections that were held 4 years ago?
In some respects, and I think I alluded to some of this in the answer to a previous question, the regime is facing a crisis that it has never faced before. It is what I would call a crisis of being overthrown. Its strategic reserves have run out, both financially and politically and otherwise. And so in this sense, the elections this year are far more important for the regime than before. And this is reflected in the comments and remarks made by every official of this regime, even people like Rouhani, whose faction candidates have been mostly disqualified. And for them, participation, a large turnout, is critical to demonstrate to the people of the world that they're still popular within Iran, that they can preserve the system and move forward. And that is why many of the regime leaders, including Khamenei and others like the Judiciary Chief Ebrahim Raisi, have said that this election is important for us because it sort of ensures and secures the survival of the regime and its security. And they have said anybody who disseminates and promulgates apathy and sort of encourages non-participation will be considered an enemy of the state.
How should one react to this election, and should anyone participate, and what is the position of the Iranian resistance?
Well, the President-elect of the National Council of Resistance, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, has said that it is the patriotic duty of all Iranians to boycott this election. And this is their bond with the martyrs of the Iranian people, particularly the 1,500 martyrs of the November 2019 uprising. Now, in respect of the first part of your question, I must say that this election is really not an election. It is a selection. It is illegitimate. As I said earlier, it's a travesty of the electoral process. So it must be rejected outright, not only by Iranians, who will, of course, reject it, and there's every indication that they will not go to the polls, but also anyone who is outside of Iran and is watching the situation in Iran, they should also speak out and call for a total boycott of the elections.
How do the Iranian people feel about all of this?
Well, the Iranian people want regime change, and that was reflected in their chants, not only in January 2020, not only in November of 2019, but even in previous years, like the uprisings in 162 cities we witnessed in December of 2017 and January of 2018. Their chants are death to the dictator, death to Khamenei, death to Rouhani, and they have said time for the mullahs to go has come. So as such, they will boycott this election. Interestingly, one of the agencies affiliated with the Iranian regime, State Radio and Television, conducted a poll recently in which 82% of those who responded said they will not take part in the election, which clearly indicates that this will be a total boycott, and Iranians are ready to move on from this regime and are looking to a democratic and a free future.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.